Hello. So Eric Zemmour finally announced his candidacy to the French presidency in the election that will take place in spring 2022. Many observers focused on 2 points. First, the way Zemmour announced his candidacy. And lots of people made jokes actually on the video in which he made that announcement. Indeed, it was quite an interesting video actually. He was sitting in a study with grand books behind him. He was reading from a paper in a special pose, special angle to the camera. Lots of people basically joked that he is trying somehow to impersonate, at least imitate, President Charles de Gaulle. Irrespective of the appearance, the other point that many observers made was his message, saying, oh, finally, now there is a clear, far right message that is extremely anti-immigrants, very apprehensive of Muslims and Islam in particular, in Europe and of course in France, that is now at the forefront of the election. Now, if we leave aside the video, though it is worthy of watching, some people will find it entertaining, the message itself of Eric Zemmour, even with his rhetoric about immigrants, Arabs, this whole idea of replacement theory that he pronounces, that somehow there is going to be a demographic change, massive demographic change in France, all of that is actually not that new. There have been several versions of these ideas in the past 20 years in the far right. However, Eric Zemmour's candidacy, I think, brings forward 3 important points. The first is an element of the message that he hinted at in his campaign, his speeches, in his writings, and made very explicit towards the very end of his video. And that is a demarcation, a huge, clear distinction between the current republic in France and France, the idea, France, the notion. Now, of course, France has had a number of republics in the past 150 years. But the point, I think, Eric Zemmour is making here is that there are certain ideas, certain principles that relate to France, the notion, France, the nation, that supersede, have primacy over the republic. And therefore, the inherent message is that if I arrive at or to the Élysée, if I become the president of France, my ideas, these ideas I'm putting forward to you now, the ideas that supposedly you would elect me to the French presidency on their basis, will be implemented even if the Republic stops me, which means I'd be willing to evolve the Republic, move to a new Republic to implement those ideas. Now, that demarcation between the Republic and France, the nation, France, the idea, and therefore that inherent message about I will implement those ideas because they take precedence, because they are in the interests of France, the idea, which is much more important than the Republic, that message is new, has never been there clearly put like that in the past 20 years, which is more or less the modern history of the far right in France. The second important development concerning the candidacy of Eric Zemmour is simply that for the first time in the past 20 years, the main, or at least one of the most important candidates of the far right is not a Le Pen. In the past 20 years, we had Le Pen père, the father, we had Marie Le Pen, the daughter, and both of them obviously had the surname of Le Pen. Now, the problem here for the far right was that the name Le Pen, because of different things in the history of the father, had many problematic echoes, issues in the minds of many French people. And therefore, many people who were sympathetic to the ideas of the far right in France found it very difficult to actually vote for someone with the surname of Le Pen. That was a weakness in the French far right in the past 2 or 3 presidential elections. Eric Zemmour comes without that baggage. There's nothing really in his background that is incredibly tainting or extremely problematic personally, and therefore to have a new candidate of or for the French far right who is not a Le Pen, that is new, and that is arguably a plus, a strength for the far right. The third development or point that emerges from Zemmour's candidacy is his impact, or the impact of that, on his rivals. On the far left, that's a long story, because here you have the far right versus the far left. But arguably the impact is not huge. It's just an ideological challenge, more stark now. On President Emmanuel Macron, the impact is debatable, but I would say it is a challenge. At the end of the day, we have a new challenger who is quite popular, has a clear message that is very much against that of Emmanuel Macron. But the interesting impact is on the right. Not the far right, the right, the Republican Party, the party of Charles de Gaulle. Now, that impact, some would say, is negative, because the far right has been rising, has been gaining ground for the past few months because of Zemmour. I think actually the impact has been, on the right, has been positive, in the sense of the Republican Party, the solid right of, or in French politics, decided to take on not just Zemmour, but also Emmanuel Macron by putting forward, by electing Valérie Pécresse as the candidate that will represent the right, the solid center right in the presidential election. And I think going for Valérie Pécresse would not have happened were it not for the candidacy and the rise of Eric Zemmour. Why? Because Valérie Pécresse was not the likely candidate of the Republican Party. They chose her, I think, because though she comes from within the political structure of France, she is not at the forefront and was not at the forefront of the establishment in the past 10 years. She was not a face that takes a lot of anger, and there is a lot of anger on the French streets right now. She is not a face that takes a lot of the anger on the street. She is a relatively new face, but a trusted candidate. In a way, some would say the right is willing to challenge the narrative of the far right, of Eric Zemmour, by putting forward safe pair of hands, solid track record, very important positions in the past 5 years or so, but importantly, somebody who is not or was not seen as the likely candidate of the right, somebody who is not, the people would say, one of those. I think that is a positive development here, again, because the right has stood up to the challenge that the far right has presented by the candidacy of Eric Zemmour. To my mind, these 3 developments are the most important outcomes of Eric Zemmour putting himself forward as a candidate in the next presidential election of France in spring 2022.